These next few episodes, I'm going to be doing some selected readings from The Good War, an oral history of World War II by Studs Terkel. If you're unfamiliar with who Studs Terkel is, the best way I can describe him is if Andrew Callahan from Channel 5 News decided that he was going to write books instead of do news reports. That is the best way that I could describe Studs Terkel's approach to writing books on history. The first story that I'm going to be reading is from Book 1, Section Neighborhood Boys. Dempsey Travis, a real estate broker and writer on Chicago's South Side. The Army was an experience unlike anything I've had in my life. I think of two armies, one black, one white. I saw German prisoners free to move around the camp, unlike black soldiers who were restricted. The Germans walked right into the doggone place like any white Americans. We were wearing the same uniform, but we were excluded. This was Camp Shenango, Pennsylvania, about 35 miles east of Youngstown, Ohio. When I arrived, I stepped into the mud up to my knees. The troop train was Jim Crow. They had a car for black soldiers and a car for whites. They went to their part and sent us to the ghetto. It seemed the Army always arranged to have black soldiers back up against the woods someplace, isolated. We were never near the main gate. If you went through camp as a visitor, you'd never know black soldiers were there, unless they happened to be working on some menial detail. They didn't have a PX that black soldiers could use. There was a white PX, but we could not use it. They set up a temporary situation in the barracks where a guy had some candy bars and a Coke. At the white PX, you could buy almost anything. We had nothing. There was no black servicemen's club, no place for recreation. The only thing guys could do is shoot craps and play cards. If lucky, they might get a pass to Sharon, about 15 miles away. Although there were 5 theaters on the post, there were none that black soldiers could use. After we'd been there a couple weeks, they decided to put a makeshift theater right in the center of the black area. You could get maybe a couple of 100 guys in, so they had to run it in shifts. A friend named Candace and I had decided we'd go to the theater that night. When we looked out, the line was so damn long, we knew we'd never get in. So we made the second shift. Wuthering Heights was the picture. As we walked out of the theater, there was a group of black soldiers standing around in a big discussion. Some black soldier's eye had been kicked out for going into the PX to get a beer. The guys were talking. We've got to do something about it. Kansas and I just walked into this. Within minutes, a caravan of 6 trucks loaded with white soldiers in battle-color fatigues, like they had in jungle warfare, looked like green leaves, camouflage. They drove up and surrounded the area, cut the street off. The lights went out and they started firing, just shooting into the goddamn crowd. Everybody started scrambling like hell. I must have run maybe 5 feet and fell. My friend Kansas beside me. I put my hand on my leg and I could feel something warm running down my pants. Funny thing is, I thought I'd be very religious at that point. Whereas I was just filled with hate. I'd say, the rotten sons of bitches. I just cursed. Meantime, shooting is still going on and men are screaming. Then the shooting subsides. Then comes a Red Cross. The guys start walking through the crowd with flashlights. This one is dead. This one is bad. I don't know how many died and how many were wounded. When they got to me, they said, he'll live. He just seems to be shot in several places. I was shot 3 times. Then they looked at my friend. They threw a flashlight on him. They said, he'll make it. N-words don't die when you shoot him in the head. This was a Red Cross worker. They took us both to the ambulance. 2 guys were sitting in front. The one says to the driver, why would we be doing this to our own soldiers? Driver says, whoever told you that N-words were our soldiers? Where I come from, I detected a southern accent. We shoot N-words like we shoot rabbits. This stayed with me. This sound of these two men talking about two disabled black soldiers, shot not by the enemy, but by Americans. We finally arrived at the base hospital, and they rolled me into the corridor. They rolled Kansas into a little room that was probably 5 feet from where I was. I could see him on his bed. The doctor looked at him, went through this raising your eyelid thing, then he started pumping his legs up about 6 or 7 times. He pulled the light out and closed the door. No one had to tell me. Kansas was dead. That night, I was rolled into a ward with other soldiers. I recognized some of the guys who had been shot. Within 40 feet of me were about 12 or 14 of these guys. There was a belief that I would never walk again. Doctors said, "You seem to be paralyzed." Well, that certainly disturbed the hell out of me. There's a guy next to me screaming and hollering. Somehow, this information never reached the newspapers. The Red Cross evidently contacted my parents. I hadn't been in the hospital 48 hours when I looked up, and here comes my father. My father with a big cigar in his mouth, looking proud. He's a stockyard worker, but never been outside Chicago since coming from Georgia. He had a walk and a proudness and an importance that you just couldn't believe. My mother, just the opposite. A very mild woman, but a smile that is so infectious, it just brightens up the room. She saw me and her eyes just started blazing with tears and smiling. Cries. Shit. When you go back and try to remember, that's hard. I mean, that's hard. Laughing and crying at the same time. Oh, God. I was so glad to see my parents. Overwhelming to be 21 years old and just totally out of it, thinking that I would never walk again. They told my parents that they would have to ship me out to the General Hospital in Butler, Pennsylvania. Whatever operation was needed was not going to take place here. Before I was shipped out, an unusual thing happened. The FBI or the CIA or G2, I don't know which, took a special interest in my case. They kept probing me at my bedside. Who did the shooting? As if I would know. How did it happen? Where were you? What were you doing prior to this happening? I told them I was in the theater and just walked out. The General Hospital is about 50 or 60 miles from Shenango. Never will forget the rolling hills of Pennsylvania. Seemed like these doggone ambulances had no springs. Every damn bump all the way. Arriving there, they put me in private quarters. The Army at that time was still very Jim Crow, even with sick people. I was isolated. The same man showed up again, civilian clothes, black pants, the whispering, the same series of questions. He assured me I'd be taken care of here. I found out later that my IQ was higher than anybody else's in the group that had been shot. They probably thought I was the ringleader. I had no idea I had a high IQ. Laughs. They didn't send anybody else out here except me. They put a screen in front of my bed. The Red Cross is passing out candy, and when this person reached my door, I heard another person say, "Oh, don't go in there. They got a C word in that room." Laughs. A doctor showed up, examines me, and says, "I think I can relieve you of this problem. It's going to take a series of operations. You may be able to walk, but never as you walked before. Probably a serious limp." That set off a set of circumstances that I'd never dealt with before. Mary, the woman who had been advised not to come into my room, a little white woman about 4'6", came in. She said, "What would you like? Candy, a magazine, a book?" I said, "I'll take 'em all." Laughs. We struck up a friendship. She said, "I notice nobody's been in to see you. As soon as the doctor gives me permission, I'm going to take you for a ride." My fever was running high as hell. Once it subsided, I went through x-rays and they determined how they're going to take out these bullets with the least amount of permanent injury. I had shrapnel across the back, right here through the thick, buttocks. It caught me as I was falling. This one 1/2 inch deep, wide as my small finger. If I weren't falling, that one would have signed me off. When they finally decided to operate, the two doctors couldn't agree on the diagnosis. One was a WASP, and one was a Jewish fella. They argued in front of me. I was a non-person. Finally, the Jewish guy won and the other resigned from the case. He took one bullet out, left one in. He said, if we remove it, it'll cause a new kind of problem. Through some miracle, the operation was partially successful. I had to drag my leg a bit, but I could feel the strength coming back. On a 30-day furlough, I returned to Chicago the fall of '43. I visited some of the clubs. Rum Boogie, Club Deluxe, Club de Lisa. Oh God, it was wonderful. I was still limping, but I saw improvement. My mother didn't want me to go back. She started writing letters to congressmen, senators, even to President Roosevelt. She told them of my experience, but I went back. I didn't walk as well as I thought I should. But this new doctor said, God damn it, boy, walk down that hill. We're going to send you back to Shenango. I didn't have any money, so Mary let me have $5. When I got back to Shenango, I discovered something. They had built a major service center for the black servicemen. They had opened up the main theater, and blacks were permitted to go. Laughs. It appears that you had to kill some guys. There was never an inquiry to my knowledge. A fellow I met a couple of years later told me he was at Shenango the night of the shooting. He spent the night under the bed. Later that night, the black guys broke into the ammunition place and got armed. This thing was not really quelled for 48 to 72 hours. It didn't die right that night. He said, all I could hear is gunshot fire throughout the night. The next day, he said, his whole outfit was shipped out overseas. They decided that what I needed improvement on was not my legs so much as my attitude. I should see a psychiatrist. Then they decided to talk about my career. Isn't that a bitch? This guy said, you can be any damn thing you want to be. You got an IQ over 137. I said, what does that mean? He said, it means you're a candidate for OCS. You can do this, you can do that, you can do the other. I wasn't impressed. I was a musician. They decided they were going to make me a leader. Laughs. They put me in charge of a troop movement going through Camp Lee, Virginia. I thought I'd seen everything. We changed trains at Washington, D.C. I thought, this being the capital of the country, I can go and get me a Coke. Ha ha, laughs. The woman said, boy, you don't drink no Cokes here. Go downstairs. I said, God, this is Washington, D.C. Laughs. She looked at me like I was crazy. I guess I was. On the train to camp, we looked out the back of the car and saw the dome of the Capitol. I said, what the hell does this mean? It didn't mean what I read in my civics books at DuSable High. In Richmond, Camp Lee is nearby. We see German PWs riding streetcars in front, the blacks in the back. It was the first time that I saw black and white water fountains. In the theater at Camp Lee, I saw black officers and black enlisted men sitting in the back behind a rope. In front were white officers and white enlisted men. The black officers seemed to show such pride. The thought went through my mind, how can you be proud of sitting behind a rope? They're telling you, boy, you are nothing. We're going to rope you off. Although there were many empty white barracks, we lived in tents. We used to sit in these damn tents in the hot sun, waiting for some available space in the camp's black belt. It lasted some 6 or 8 months. The lying and dreaming that soldiers would do among themselves is unbelievable. I'd only finished high school, but these sophisticates from Philadelphia, from Baltimore, were talking about what colleges they'd been to. Black colleges. They were going to do this. They were going to do that. This is a training camp for quartermasters. These guys with college training were sent to cooking schools, digging schools, motor vehicle. I was sent to the administrative school. This puts you in a position to becoming a master sergeant. I was there 3 days and yanked. We have orders to ship you out in charge of another cadre to Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. I said, why? I like this school. I was learning how to type. I'm trying to become an elitist, you see. Laughs. I had decided I was going to make something of myself as a good soldier. At Aberdeen, I'm assigned to all these guys doing KP duty. Kitchen, police, trash detail, truck detail, picking up garbage. For 3 weeks, I'm laying around. I don't really have an assignment. One day an officer sends for me. Travis, I see you have a good record. What would you like to do? What can I do? I'm a musician, he said. We don't have a band here, but your IQ indicates you can do much more than that. The next day I see a Major Sloan, a tall, red-faced, freckled, moon-shaped faced, big blue-eyed ex-Texas Ranger. He said, "Can you type?" I said, "No, sir." "Have you ever worked in an office?" "No, sir." He reaches into the drawer and pulls out a typing book. He calls in a corporal and says, "You give Private Travis that desk behind you. He's going to learn how to type." I'll never forget Major Sloan. He recognized that as a piano player I used my fingers, and it wouldn't take much for me to become a typist. He kept at me for about a month. I got up to 55 words a minute. He called me back. "Have you ever worked in a store?" "No, sir." He said, "I want you to work in the post exchange as a clerk." In about 3 months, he said, "We're going to make you an assistant manager." Within 2 months, I was the manager. This was a black PX. But that was not enough for him. He decided he wants me to manage the white PX as well. This was early 45, just before Roosevelt died. They were beginning to integrate the facilities. So I was the first guy to become manager of an integrated PX in the state of Maryland. I won first prize for the best managed store in Aberdeen Proving Grounds. Sloan brought the post commander down to me, a general. "We're going to have the newspapers take pictures of you because we're very proud of what you're doing." A couple of days later, he came back. "Travis, that picture will never appear in the paper. Those fellas can't stand the idea of a black man being able to operate a post exchange in this manner." The picture never appeared. I found the most sympathetic white man in the Army were actually Southerners. I found this to be true in civilian life as well. The best breaks I've got as a businessman have come from guys out of Alabama and Georgia. If they decide they're going to go with you, they go all the damn way. And no forked tongue. Laughs. The author asks, "What about your limp? I don't notice any." Bit by bit it disappeared as my leg got stronger. I still have the bullet in my hip. No compensation. Of course not. I was in from September 9th, 1942 to February 2nd, 1946. When I was about to get discharged, Major Sloan said, "Why don't you stay? I want to send you to officer candidate school. You'd make a damn fine officer." But I'd had enough. I said, "Let me get out as early as you can, so I can at least go to school under the GI Bill." I took entrance exams at Roosevelt, at DePaul, at Northwestern. I got 3 letters back saying pretty much the same thing. "Look, you dumb son of a bitch, don't ever try to get into college, 'cause you just ain't got what it takes. Try using your arms, try using your back. They never said try using your head." I was so goddamn depressed. I did what my father did. I went to work at the stockyards. As a laborer, a Georgia mule. At noontime, all the guys would gather around me as I told stories. The foreman, a big Irishman, came up to me. "I'm going to fire you. Know why? You're too smart to be out here. You can do better than this. You should be doing income tax or something." So I started working out income tax problems for relatives and friends. I didn't know anything about income tax, but if you can count, you can figure out a form. In the meantime, an old teacher met me on the street and said, "Why don't you try Inglewood Evening Junior College? You don't have to take an entrance exam." I enrolled in Accounting 101 and Sociology 101. It restored my confidence. I enrolled at Wilson Junior College, and I ended up in remedial everything. Reading, writing. I was stupid enough to enroll in American Literature 117. I remember turning in my first paper on Silas Marner. The teacher was furious. He thought it was a joke. It was that bad. It was my crazy stubbornness that persuaded him not to kick me out. One day, it just came to me. The whole meaning. The whole concept. No person who learned to read normally, at the regular age, can understand this experience. To learn to read as a man, 27 years old, it's just like somebody lifted a veil off your eyes. Laughs and cries. I went to Roosevelt and finished 2 years in one. That's the story of me and the GI Bill. I paid my tuition, and that made the difference. If anything positive came out of the war, that was it. My mother was glad I was alive. My father was always kind of laid back and important. He was not an emotional man. All the emotion was on my mother's side. And on my side. Laughs. He didn't appreciate how much I loved him until I started getting these promotions in the army. I would send him a box of cigars and he would talk of my boy the sergeant. While I was still in the army, he died. On my emergency furlough, I saw him the last day at County Hospital. His last words were, "Boy, you're the man of the house now. You gotta take care of your mother." My mother's 86 now and I'm still taking care of her. Those 4 years in the army are the turning point of my life. I learned something about men. I learned something about racism. I learned something about values. I learned something about myself. I don't think I'd had that experience any other place or time. Under no other circumstance would I have seen so many men in one setting where I would evaluate them and myself. Imagine Major Sloan. Would you believe that he insisted I study the Bretton Woods reports and explain it to the troops? I, who could hardly read. See the boy run. The cat jumped the fence. How can I ever forget this experience and this man? I see World War II as having been a step on the first rung of the ladder, but I wouldn't want to wish it on anybody else. At the beginning of Dempsey Travis's story, when he's talking about his experience on base here in the United States, I often think back to people who always talk about how the World War II generation is the greatest generation that ever lived. When you look at like the amount of racism that occurred, yeah, that's a bunch of fucking bullshit. They were nowhere near the greatest generation that ever lived. Perhaps individuals like Dempsey Travis would be considered the greatest generation ever because they were fighting the war on two fronts, at home and abroad, and also putting up with racism at the same time. And when people try to defend the trailer trash of this era by saying things like, oh, well, they were just products of their time, don't give me that shit, because John Brown was a thing during the Civil War. For those of you who are unfamiliar with who John Brown was, he was a white Puritan and an abolitionist. He vehemently hated the idea of slavery so much that historians consider him one of the leading exponents of violence in the American abolitionist movement. Another fact of the matter that I need to bring up from this time period is if the abolition of slavery wasn't such a popular thing, then it wouldn't have happened. So obviously there were a large amount of decent white people who wanted slavery to go away. So this idea of shitty racist white people being products of their time kind of falls flat on its fucking face. Just to play devil's advocate here, it's not like the northern states had this noble reason to abolish slavery. The bourgeoisie of the North at this period were trying to utilize machinery for its production processes, but could not compete with the profitability of slavery in the South. Because at the end of the day, they weren't paying the slaves anything, so they were raking in all the profits. Now, how much of the northern working class knew of the northern bourgeois' underlying reason for why they wanted to abolish slavery? I have no idea. I'm willing to wager, however, that there were more than a handful of white people who felt the same way that John Brown did. People who thought that the golden rule was a standard by which they lived their lives. Going back to Dempsey Travis's story, I want to talk about the difficulties that he faced when he was trying to get into college. Taking the time period into account, he most likely had difficulty getting into a university due to racism. What I want to talk about, however, is the fact that he had a very high intelligence quotient, and yet he had difficulty passing the entrance exam. Personally, I've always felt that standardized tests and examinations are not an accurate test of a person's comprehension of information learned. I like to think that intelligence is a culmination of a person learning the information and then either observing or testing it in the real world. Take, for example, Albert Einstein. I really don't like it when people say that he was just naturally intelligent. I feel like that this is an insult to the amount of hard work and effort that Albert Einstein put into learning and testing this information in the real world. Going back to Dempsey failing his entrance exams, I feel like that's more of a failure of the university system on him more than anything else. I can relate to Dempsey in that prior to me joining the Navy, I felt like I was pretty mediocre and that I was going to live out a fairly mediocre life and not really amount to anything. It wasn't until I joined that I was not only challenged by different people in the Navy, but they also exercised a lot of faith in my ability to do things. And it was through their faith in me that I was able to rise to the occasion and realize that I was capable of a lot more than I had originally thought I was capable of. Now, in no way, shape, or form is this an endorsement of the military, which is something that I will get into in a later episode. In conclusion, I feel bad that Dempsey went through what he did when he was stationed on the base in the United States. Witnessing the death of your friend at the hands of the people who you thought were on your side must have been an extremely traumatic event for him. Dempsey, however, did not stay a real estate broker. He ended up becoming a civil rights activist later in life, also a prominent historian and author, writing extensively on African American history, politics, social issues, and music. Dempsey Travis passed away in 2009 at the age of 89. Rest in power, Dempsey Travis.